They say time puts everyone in their place, but I prefer to think of time as life's greatest master of ceremonies. It loves to set the stage for moments where the one who laughs last doesn't always laugh best. I looked at Richard's hands I once held with hope, and that later pushed me into the abyss, and I saw how the weight of cruelty ages a person from the inside out. He stood there, bitter, trying to wound me with the only weapon he had left in his memory: prejudice. When he mocked my son's life, asking if Matthew had died, I closed my eyes for a second. I remembered the rain, the cold, and the door slamming in my face 2 decades ago. Richard thought he had left me in ruins, but he had only set me free. He didn't know that while he was rotting from the inside, my special son was building a palace of knowledge from what he had called a death sentence. I call it a rebirth, and the stage for this revelation couldn't have been more fitting. The hospital where my son is the law. That hospital smell, a cold mix of antiseptic with the distant aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the cafe on the first floor, always had the power to transport me to different moments in my life. But on that Tuesday morning, the air seemed heavier, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up beneath the light fabric of my linen dress. I was sitting in the reception area of the specialty wing, a place that exuded competence, and let's be honest, a certain status. The walls were a soft cream decorated with abstract paintings, meant to bring calm to troubled hearts, and the armchairs were plush leather that cradled a tired body. I, however, was not tired. At 60, I felt a vitality I never imagined I'd have when I was younger. My posture was straight, my hands rested calmly on my purse, and I watched the comings and goings with the serenity of someone who has seen the worst of life and survived to tell the tale. It was then that the automatic glass door slid open with a mechanical whisper, and he walked in. Richard, the man who for so many years was the villain of my nightmares, was now nothing more than a pathetic figure shuffling through the lobby. He wore a suit that probably cost a fortune, but hung awkwardly on his now thin and stooped frame, as if his own arrogance had consumed his flesh, leaving only the shell. He leaned on a dark wood cane, and each step seemed to demand an effort he tried to mask with a look of disdain. Our eyes met almost instantly, as if fate had tied an invisible thread between us 22 years ago, and was now pulling the ends for a final reckoning. He stopped. I saw recognition flash in his eyes, followed immediately by that cruel, twisted smile I knew so well. He walked toward me, ignoring the empty chairs, ignoring social distancing, ignoring decency. He stopped just inches away, invading my space with an expensive cologne that barely managed to cover the acrid smell of sickness and stale tobacco seeping from his pores. "Sarah," his voice came out raspy like old sandpaper on rough wood. "Well, look at you. Still trying to keep up the grand dame appearances, aren't you? But tell me something I've always been curious about since fate has thrown us into this ridiculous waiting room. Where is that deficient son of yours? Did he finally die, or is he still the burden you insisted on carrying all by yourself, the one that destroyed my life?" The question hung in the air, toxic and thick. People around us reading magazines or scrolling on their phones looked up surprised by the brutality of his words. But I didn't flinch, I didn't scream. I simply looked at him with a calm that unnerved him. He expected to see the tearful begging. 8-year-old Sarah. But the woman before him was the 6-0-year-old Sarah, armored by life. Inside me, a movie began to play. Not the movie of my current victory, but of how we had reached this point. The movie of a pain that was necessary for me to be sitting there whole while he was falling apart. Before I open the doors of my memory and tell you how this man managed to enter my life and nearly destroy everything I had, I wanted to ask you for a small favor, friend to friend. I know many of us carry scars that no one sees. And if you're feeling that this story somehow connects with your soul, if you understand what it's like to have to be strong when the world wants you to crumble, please leave a like on this. It's such a simple gesture, but it's like a hug you're giving me from a distance. Also, tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. I imagine each of you in your corners of the country connected to me through this story. And if you're not yet part of our circle, please subscribe to the channel. I promise you that every word spoken here is born from a real experience, from a mother who learned that the bottom of the pit can be the very place where we find the leverage to climb out. Now come with me. Let's go back in time to an era when I still believed love was only poetry and not a battlefield. For you to understand the depth of the hole Richard threw me into, you need to know the person I was before him. At 37, I was living a moment of fulfillment that seemed unbreakable. I lived in a small town in North Carolina, a place where time moved a little slower, and people still greeted each other by name on the street. I wasn't rich, I never was, but I had my job, my house, neat with fresh flowers every week, and most importantly, I had David. David wasn't the most handsome man in town, nor the richest, but he had the noblest soul I had ever encountered. He was a civil engineer, always with his boots caked in red clay, and he had an easy laugh that could disarm any bad mood. We loved each other with that mature intensity of people who no longer have time for games. Our plans were concrete: get married at the end of the year, buy a small farmhouse, and fill the house with children. I vividly remember the last night we were together. There was a full moon illuminating the porch of my house, and we were sitting on the swing, rocking gently. He stroked my hair and talked about the names we would give our children. "If it's a boy, he'll have your strength, Sarah. If it's a girl, I want her to have your eyes," he'd said. We had a silly argument that night, the kind of thing couples who love each other too much bicker about insignificant details about renovating the house. He left blowing me a kiss, saying he'd be back the next day to fix everything. But the next day never came for us. That dawn, a torrential rain fell on the winding road that connected my house to his. David's truck hydroplaned. It was quick, the state troopers said. He didn't suffer, the doctors assured me, but I suffered. Oh, how I suffered. Grief hit me like a derailed train. The physical pain of losing a great love is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. It's like you can't breathe, like the world has lost its color. I spent weeks in a zombie-like state, moving from the bedroom to the living room, not eating, not sleeping, just existing in a void of nostalgia. And it was in the midst of that emotional winter, about a month and a half after the funeral, that I started feeling nauseous. At first I thought it was just sadness churning my stomach, but a woman's body knows. The missed period, the tenderness in my breasts. I took the pharmacy test with trembling hands alone in the cold, blue-tiled bathroom. Positive. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees, crying a mixture of desperation and miracle. I was pregnant with David's child. A part of him had stayed with me. It was a gift, yes, but it was also terrifying. I was 37 and alone, about to be a single mother in a society that at the time still looked sideways at women in my situation. It was on this stage of extreme fragility that Richard made his entrance. He wasn't a stranger. He was a distant colleague from work, someone I saw at company dinners, always impeccable, always polite, but someone who had never caught my attention. Richard heard about David's death and began to show up. First it was a condolence text, then a quick visit to see if I needed anything. Soon he started bringing food offering to handle bureaucratic paperwork, fixing things around the house. He was helpful, soft-spoken, and listened to my endless tears about David without complaint. Little by little, he began to fill the empty spaces in my routine. He presented himself as a friend, a guardian angel sent to take care of me. When I told him about the pregnancy, I expected him to pull away. After all, who would want to take on another man's child, especially a deceased man's, and get involved with an emotionally shattered woman? But Richard's reaction was worthy of a Hollywood actor. I remember us sitting on my living room sofa, my eyes swollen, holding the test result. He took my hand, looked me in the eyes with an intensity I mistook for love, and said, "Sarah, this isn't a problem. It's a blessing. I've always wanted to be a father. I can take care of you and this child. I can be the father he needs." At that moment, I was so desperate for security, so terrified of raising a child alone in the world, that I believed him. I believed he was sent from God. I believed he had a heart noble enough to love a child that wasn't his blood. I didn't see the signs. I didn't see how he subtly began to push my friends away, saying I needed to rest. I didn't see how he started to control my finances, saying I was in no condition to think about money. I only saw the outstretched hand, and I grabbed it with all the strength I had left. At 5 months pregnant, my belly already showing, we got married. It was a discreet civil ceremony at the courthouse. I wore a loose cream dress, and he wore a flawless gray suit. In the photos from that day, if you look closely, my smile doesn't reach my eyes. It's a smile of gratitude, of relief, but not of passion. His smile, however, his smile was one of possession. He had conquered the sad widow. He had become the town hero, the generous man who saved poor Sarah and her orphan. The following months were a haze of adjustment. Richard kept the mask on at first. He came with me to prenatal appointments, held my hand during ultrasounds, and even painted the baby's room a sky blue. But there were moments, brief flashes, when the mask slipped. I remember one night when the baby gave a strong kick. I took Richard's hand and placed it on my belly, excited. "Feel that, Richard. He's strong," I said, laughing. He felt the movement, but pulled his hand away quickly as if he'd gotten a shock. "Yes. Let's hope he gets my intelligence since he doesn't have my blood," he muttered, turning over to sleep. That stung, but I rationalized it. It's normal, I thought. He must have his insecurities. It's hard for a man to raise another man's son. I overlooked his attitudes because I needed to believe I had made the right choice. I needed this to work. As the due date approached, Richard's anxiety grew, but it wasn't the anxiety of an expectant father. It was that of an investor waiting to see his return on capital. He talked a lot about what the boy would be like, how he would enroll him in the best schools, how he would be an athlete, a leader. He projected onto my son, David's son, all the frustrations of his own mediocre life. He wanted a trophy to show off to his friends at the country club. "My son is going to be the best," he'd repeat. And I naively would nod, not realizing that for Richard, being the best was the only condition for being loved. I was blinded by fear, by gratitude, by the need for survival. I didn't realize I had let a fox into the henhouse. I was sleeping next to a man who didn't love me and certainly not the baby I was carrying. He loved the idea of a picture-perfect family from a margarine commercial. He loved the image I provided him. And to my detriment, I didn't know that image was about to be shattered in the cruelest way possible. Today, sitting here under the air conditioning of this luxury hospital, looking at the broken Richard in front of me, I can see clearly what I couldn't see then. I see the vanity, the selfishness, the smallness. When he asked, "Where is your deficient son?" he wasn't just trying to offend me, he was confessing his own failure, because he believed that a child with a disability was the end of the world while I discovered it was just the beginning of a new one. His question hung in the air, waiting for an answer. My mind returned from the past, landing in the present with the weight of an anchor. I took a deep breath, feeling the smell of clinical cleanliness fill my lungs and prepared not my voice but my spirit. The silence of the reception was about to be broken, but not by my words. Fate, that capricious master of ceremonies, had already cued the entrance of the next character. And I knew Richard was not ready for what was coming. The storm he had created in the past was returning, but this time I was the one holding the umbrella. As I stared at Richard in that cold reception area, feeling the weight of his gaze on me, my mind traveled back to the final months of that pregnancy, which at the time seemed to be the passport to my happiness. It's funny how memory works. I can clearly recall the smell of fresh paint in the nursery we prepared for Matthew. It was a soft blue chosen by Richard, who insisted everything be top of the line. He brought home furniture catalogs, debated which stroller was the most modern, the safest, the one celebrities used. At the time, I mistook his vanity for diligence. I'd watch him organize the baby shower, inviting bosses and influential colleagues, and think, wow, he really wants to be a father. But I didn't realize he wasn't setting up a room for a child. He was setting a stage for his ego. He would stroke my belly not to feel life pulsing, but to ensure his investment was growing according to plan. He'd say things that back then just seemed demanding, but which today I see as bright red flags. "Sarah, are you eating right? I don't want this child born weak. He has to be robust, have a presence." Or, "I've already signed him up for infant swim classes. They say it helps motor development. My son will swim before he can walk." Note that he always said "my son" when talking about future achievements. But when I had an ache or felt nauseous, he'd say, "Your son is giving you a hard time today." That subtle shift in pronouns already revealed he only wanted the glorious part of fatherhood, the messy, exhausting human part that he left entirely to me. I submerged in the blind gratitude of someone saved from widowhood, and loneliness would just smile and nod, trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect incubator for the heir he so idealized. I remember the night before I went into labor. We were lying in bed, and I felt an anxiety mixed with that profound joy only a mother knows. I took Richard's hand and placed it on my belly where Matthew was moving slowly. "He's coming soon, Richard. Tomorrow, our life changes," I whispered. He sighed a heavy sound and replied, "I hope he has my eyes, Sarah." "David." Well, David was a simple man. But I want this boy to have my look, the look of a winner. That hurt, but I swallowed it down. I didn't want to spoil the moment. I didn't want to admit I was sleeping next to a man who was competing with a ghost. Little did I know that in less than 24 hours, the color of the baby's eyes would be the least of Richard's concerns. Before I take you into that delivery room and tell you the exact moment my fairy tale turned into a horror movie, I want to take a quick pause here. I know many of you listening have felt the pressure to be perfect to meet the impossible expectations of others. If you've ever felt pressured by something you couldn't control, please give this video a like. It's our way of telling each other we're not alone on this journey. And tell me in the comments, do you think true love comes with conditions? I'll read every response with care. Now take a deep breath with me, because we're about to enter the day that split my life into a before and an after. Labor started in the early morning, intense and fast. We went to the private maternity ward covered by Richard's insurance, the best in the city. He was euphoric, filming everything, joking with the nurses, playing the part of Father of the Year. He spoke loudly in the hallways. The champion is born today. I, between contractions, tried to keep a smile on my face, but I felt a pang of fear I couldn't explain. A mother's intuition, perhaps. The birth was natural. I remember the pushing, the sweat, the encouragement from the medical team, and then the cry, that sharp, liberating cry that announces life. The doctor held up the baby, my Matthew. He was small, pink, covered in that white vernix that protects the skin. My heart exploded with love. I reached out my arms, desperate to hold him. But there was a strange silence in the room. Not a total silence, but a pause. The obstetrician exchanged a quick glance with the pediatrician. Richard's smile as he held the camera faltered. "What is it? Why are you looking at each other?" he asked, his voice already tinged with a latent irritation. The pediatrician took Matthew, cleaned him quickly, and brought him to me. But before placing him in my arms, he looked at Richard and said with professional calm, "Father, mother, the baby is doing wonderfully. He's breathing well, he's strong. But we've noticed some phenotypical characteristics that suggest a genetic condition. We'll need to do a karyotype to confirm, but all signs point to trisomy 21. Richard lowered the camera slowly. "Triso, what? What are you talking about?" he asked harshly. "Down syndrome," the doctor replied softly. The world stopped. I looked at my son. I saw his almond-shaped eyes, the single crease across the palm of his hand, the slightly flatter back of his head. And you know what I felt? Love. An overwhelming, protective, fierce love. He was mine. He was perfect in his uniqueness. I clutched him to my chest and kissed his damp forehead. "Hello, my love. Hello, Matthew. Mommy's here," I cried with emotion. But then I looked to my side, and what I saw in Richard's eyes wasn't love or fear or doubt. It was disgust. A visceral revulsion, as if I were holding something contagious, something dirty. He took a step back, his back hitting the cold, tiled wall. That's not mine," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "That can't be my son. You said he was healthy, Sarah. You lied to me." The nurses looked at him scandalized. "Sir, please calm down," the doctor urged. But Richard was beside himself. His vanity had suffered a mortal blow. The trophy he had expected to display was broken. "I'm not raising a retard," he screamed. And that word echoed in the delivery room like a gunshot. I covered my baby's ears as if I could protect him from that verbal violence in his first minutes of life. Richard stormed out of the room, slamming the door, leaving me there with my son in my arms and my heart in pieces. In that moment, I knew my marriage was over. I just didn't know the ordeal had only just begun. The days in the hospital were a humiliating loneliness. Richard only appeared to pay the bill and take me home, fulfilling a social obligation so people wouldn't talk. He didn't look at Matthew in the car. The silence was so thick I could hear my own ragged breathing. He drove with his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, refusing to turn his head toward the car seat in the back. We arrived home, and that beautiful house I thought would be our sanctuary now felt like a mausoleum. He carried my suitcase, dropped it in the living room, and said, without looking at me, "I'll be sleeping in the guest room. His crying irritates me." And he went upstairs. The next 10 months were without a doubt the bleakest period of my existence. I lived like a ghost in my own home. Richard became a hostile stranger. He stopped inviting friends over, stopped answering the house phone when he was around. He was ashamed, a deep, sick shame for Matthew's existence. If someone on the street asked, "How's the baby?" he'd answer curtly, "He's fine," and change the subject. He never, not once, held Matthew. He would walk past the crib as if it were an unwanted piece of furniture he didn't know how to throw out. And Matthew. Oh, Matthew was an angel. He was a calm baby who smiled easily, who looked at me with a sweetness that seemed to say, "It's okay, Mom, we'll get through this." But his development was a bit slower as expected. It took him longer to hold his head up. He had muscle hypotonia that made his body feel soft. It required physical therapy, stimulation, dedication. And every time I asked Richard for money to pay for a therapy session, he would scoff. "What for? Why waste money on that, Sarah? He's not going to become an athlete. He's not going to be an engineer. You're throwing money away trying to fix what was born broken." Each of those phrases was a stab. I'd swallow my tears, take the money he threw on the table, and leave. I left because my son depended on me. I was the only barrier between Matthew and total contempt. The routine at home became unbearable. Richard started coming home later and later, smelling of alcohol and cheap perfume. He looked for reasons to fight. If dinner wasn't on the table at the exact time, it was a scandal. If Matthew cried from colic, he would scream from the other room, "Shut that kid up, I need to sleep." I worked to support this disaster. I spent my nights pacing the house with the baby in my arms, whispering lullabies, trying to muffle any sound that might awaken his father's fury. I became a thin shadow with deep, dark circles under my eyes, living in a constant state of alert. I knew this couldn't last, but the fear of having nowhere to go paralyzed me. I had no family nearby, no savings. I had quit my job at his request. I was trapped. But fate has a funny way of pushing you when you refuse to jump. The final break happened on a Tuesday night, a night that is seared into my memory. It was summer, and one of those violent thunderstorms had crashed down on the city. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rattled the windows. Matthew, at 10 months old, had a fever, crying irritable from an ear infection. I was exhausted walking back and forth in the living room trying to soothe him. The front door flew open. Richard stumbled in, soaked his eyes red and glassy. He wasn't just drunk. He was determined. He looked at me, looked at a crying Matthew, and let out a dry, humorless laugh. "It's over," he said. "It's just over." "What's over, Richard?" I asked, hugging my son tighter, feeling his feverish little body against mine. He walked to the coffee table, kicked a toy of Matthew's that was on the floor, and yelled, "This mediocre life is over. I'm done coming home to this. This defective thing." Crying. "I didn't get married for this. Sarah, I got married to have a picture-perfect family, a son I could take to the club, not one I have to hide." His words hit me, but this time something shifted. The fear gave way to a cold fury. "He is not a thing, Richard. He is your son. He is a human being and he is sick. He needs medicine, not your yelling." I replied, my voice firm for the first time in months. Richard stopped, surprised by my reaction. Then his face contorted into pure hatred. "My son never. That's the son of that dead guy. He's a punishment he left you with, and I'm tired of paying for it." He went into the bedroom, and I heard the sound of drawers being violently opened and slammed shut. He returned with one of my suitcases, an old one I'd brought from my single days, and started throwing my clothes into it haphazardly. "What are you doing?" I screamed. "Setting you free, Sarah. And setting myself free. Get out. I want you and that kid out of my house." "Now," he snarled, throwing the open suitcase into the middle of the living room. I looked out the window. The rain was falling in a solid sheet. "Richard, it's pouring. Matthew has a fever. Have some mercy. We'll leave tomorrow. Let us sleep here just for tonight," I pleaded. Not for myself, but for my baby. He came close to me, the stench of alcohol invading my nostrils, and said the words that sealed our fate. "Mercy. Who had mercy on me when you gave me a useless son? Figure it out, Sarah. You're his mother, right? Well, protect your kid. But not under my roof." He grabbed my arm and pushed me toward the door. I grabbed the diaper bag, my wallet, some documents. I grabbed a coat and wrapped Matthew as best I could. He opened the front door, and a cold wind swept into the warm living room. "Go," he yelled over the sound of the thunder. "Go and don't come back. And don't you dare ask me for child support to raise that thing. If you have any dignity, you'll disappear from my life." I looked at him one last time. I didn't see a husband. I didn't see a man. I saw a small, scared monster, afraid of his own shadow. "You will regret this, Richard," I said, my voice low, but clear. "One day you will need this useless boy. And on that day, may God have mercy on you, because you've had none for us." He slammed the door in my face. The sound of the deadbolt turning was the most final sound I had ever heard. I was on the sidewalk in the torrential rain, the icy water soaking my clothes and Matthew's blanket in seconds. The baby cried loudly, frightened by the noise and the cold. I pressed him against me, trying to create a shell with my own body. The street was deserted, dark, flooded. I had no car, no umbrella, nowhere to go. Hot tears streamed down my face, mixing with the cold rain. I felt like trash. I felt I had failed as a woman and as a mother for choosing that man. I walked to the nearest bus stop, which had a flimsy, leaky metal shelter. I sat on the freezing concrete bench, shivering uncontrollably. Matthew was sobbing in my lap, the fever making his skin burn. I looked at that empty street, the lights of the houses where normal families slept warm in their beds, and I felt a pain so deep I thought my chest would break. But then I looked at my son's small face. He stopped crying for a moment and looked up at me. His almond-shaped eyes, deep and innocent, seemed to glow in the gloom. He placed his tiny hand on my wet face. In that touch, in that gesture, so small and yet so immense, something happened. The submissive Sarah, the Sarah who accepted crumbs, died right there at that bus stop. And in her place, a lioness was born. I wiped my tears with the sleeve of my soaked blouse. "We're going to get through this, baby boy," I whispered to him and to myself. "He thinks he's destroyed us, but he's only given us a chance to start over. I will be your father and your mother. I will give you the world, Matthew. And one day that man will look up and see us flying so high he'll get dizzy just from watching." I spent the night there holding my son, waiting for dawn. The cold was terrible, hunger was starting to set in, and the fear of the future was a giant before me. But I had something Richard would never have. I had love, and I had a purpose. As the rain subsided and the sky began to turn gray with the coming of day, I made a silent promise. I promised that I would turn every humiliation into a stepping stone, every no into fuel. Richard had thrown me out of his house, but he had given me back to myself. The day dawned gray, but for me, it was the beginning of my real life. I stood up, my body aching, my clothes heavy with water, but my soul light, belonging to someone who owed nothing to anyone. I took the first bus that came, not knowing exactly where I was going, but knowing that any place far from Richard was paradise. I looked out the bus window, watching the city wake up, and I stroked Matthew's head. "Here we go, my little doctor," I said, not knowing how prophetic that phrase would be. "Our story starts now." And little did I know that the fragile baby in my lap carried a brilliant mind that years later would make that arrogant man tremble with shame. The journey would be hard. Oh, you better believe it would be hard. But I was willing to walk over hot coals if necessary. Richard had sown the wind, and the storm he was about to reap was just beginning to form far from his sight. In the silence of my daily struggle, the reality of the morning after our eviction was anything but poetic. It was cold, hard, and numerical. I was 39 years old, with $40 in my wallet, a suitcase of damp clothes, and a baby with a fever. I managed to rent a room in the back of a house owned by a widow named Mrs. Gable, who agreed to let me have the space without a credit check, just with the upfront payment of the little I had. The room was a square of polished concrete with a sink in one corner and a tiny bathroom in the other. There was no furniture. That first week we slept on a thin foam mattress she lent me, spread directly on the floor. It was there, in that setting of absolute scarcity, that I decided there would be no room for laments. Richard had kept the comfort, but I had kept the responsibility, and you can't delegate responsibility. I started working the very next day. There was no time to choose a career. I got 3 regular housekeeping jobs in family homes, and at night I worked as a waitress at a local diner. My routine began at 4 a.m. I would leave Matthew with a neighbor who charged very little to watch kids. I'd take 2 crowded buses and spend the day scrubbing floors, cleaning bathrooms, and swallowing my pride when homeowners complained about a speck of dust in the corner of a shelf. My hands, which had once only typed in an office, became calloused. My skin cracked from the bleach, and back pain became a constant companion. But the money came in, not much hard-earned, but it was ours. We didn't owe anything to anyone, least of all to Richard. Matthew grew up in this environment. His health required care. Down syndrome brought with it a low immunity, recurrent ear infections, and the muscle hypotonia that left him soft. I spent nights in the waiting rooms of public health clinics, waiting to be seen for high fevers, holding him in my arms for hours. His motor development was slow. It took him a while to sit up on his own. It took him almost 2 years to take his first steady steps. Anyone looking from the outside saw only the disability. They saw the child who drooled a little more, whose tongue protruded, who seemed different. But inside our humble room, I began to notice something that didn't fit with what the doctors said about his limitations. At 3, Matthew didn't say many words, but he had astonishing concentration. He would spend hours looking at the labels on food containers, old newspapers I brought home from my cleaning jobs, signs on the street. I thought he just liked the colors. One day I was sorting bills to pay and left a box of medicine on the bed. He picked up the box, looked at me, and said with slightly slurred but perfectly understandable diction, "Acetaminophen." I froze. I thought I had misheard. I picked up another box. "And this, sweetie?" He read ibuprofen. My son, who could barely run without tripping, was reading pharmaceutical terms at age 3. It wasn't a miracle. It was a fact. I took him to a speech therapist at the clinic and told her what happened. She was skeptical, thinking I had taught him to memorize the words. But when she showed him flashcards with random words and he read them all, her expression changed from skepticism to amazement. We were referred for a neuropsychological evaluation at a state university. It took months of testing. The result came in a technical, detailed report. Matthew had double exceptionality. He had trisomy 21, but he was also profoundly gifted. His brain processed information at a speed far above average, even if his body couldn't keep up. He had the mind of a Formula One car trapped in the chassis of a station wagon. This discovery changed our survival strategy. I understood that the only way out of that poverty, the only revenge against the fate Richard had imposed on us, was Matthew's brain. Getting him into school, however, was a bureaucratic war. The local public schools didn't want to accept him, or wanted to put him in life skills classes only. I fought. I printed out the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, I brought the giftedness report, I slammed my fist on the principal's desk. I got him enrolled in a mainstream classroom, and that's when the social hell began. The kids made fun of his appearance, of his slurred speech. He would come home quiet sometimes, with his school supplies hidden or broken. But Matthew had a logical resilience. He didn't respond with aggression. He responded with facts. By age 7, he already knew the 5th grade curriculum. While his classmates were memorizing multiplication tables, he was doing complex mental calculations. The teachers, initially reluctant, were forced to surrender to the evidence. He would correct errors in textbooks. He could explain the water cycle better than the science teacher. At 10, the school proposed grade acceleration. He skipped 2 grades. At 12, he skipped another. He was a boy with Down syndrome among typical teenagers, but academically, he was light years ahead. Our routine was military. I worked double shifts to buy secondhand books. Matthew didn't have a video game console, a smartphone, or designer clothes. He had a library card and an old computer someone donated where he watched online lectures on biology and chemistry. He developed an obsession with the human body. He said he wanted to understand why his body was different. "I'm going to fix the glitches," Mom, he'd say, focused on anatomy books that were too heavy for his arms but light for his mind. At 16, he decided to take the SAT to study medicine. Mrs. Gable's family laughed. They said I was deluding the boy that he'd never pass, that his motor coordination wouldn't allow him to be a doctor. I turned a deaf ear. Matthew studied 14 hours a day. He taped chemistry notes to the bathroom walls. He listened to audiobooks while he ate. He memorized entire compendiums. The day of the SATs, I drove him to the testing center. He wore a simple white t-shirt and jeans. People stared. A security guard even asked if he was in the right place, thinking he was there for some special accommodation test. Matthew just showed his ID and walked in. The results silenced everyone. Matthew scored in the 99th percentile. His admission to a top pre-med program with a full scholarship made the local news. When his name appeared on the acceptance list, I didn't cry poetic tears of joy. I felt the relief of someone who has won a high-stakes bet. But admission was just the beginning of the real battle. Medical school is an elitist, cruel environment. The first year was brutal. Some professors refused to call on him, thinking he'd slow down the class. In anatomy labs, his fine motor skills were a challenge. His hands trembled when using a scalpel. That's when Matthew showed what he was made of. He knew he wouldn't be a plastic surgeon or someone who needed extreme manual dexterity. He focused on diagnostics, on clinical practice, on neuroscience. He compensated for his manual difficulty with an encyclopedic knowledge. In his 3rd year, during rounds at the university hospital, a renowned professor humiliated a group of students, quizzing them on a rare autoimmune disease. No one knew the answer. Matthew, from the back, raised his hand and described the syndrome, the treatment, the medication dosage, and the side effects, citing an article that had been published the previous week in an international medical journal. The professor was speechless. From that day on, the student with Down syndrome became the class genius. I kept working hard to cover the indirect costs of his education: stethoscopes, scrubs, books, transportation. I baked cakes to sell. I cleaned houses until my joints screamed. I took care of the elderly on weekends. I aged quickly during those 6 years. My hair turned gray, wrinkles appeared, and exhaustion settled into my bones. But every time I saw Matthew in his white coat leaving the house at 5 a.m. for a shift, I knew the investment had paid off. He never missed a single day, never complained of being tired once. He had a clear goal to be the best. Not out of vanity, but to prove that competence has no face. The graduation took place 2 months ago. It was no ordinary event. When they called his name to receive his diploma, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. Not out of pity, but out of respect. He graduated summa cum laude among the top students of the decade. Seeing my son, that baby rejected in the rain, holding that degree, reciting the Hippocratic Oath, was the material confirmation of my victory. He matched directly into a clinical neurology residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the best in the country, the very place we were now. And this is where we returned to the cold reception area. Richard had no idea about this journey. For him, time had stopped on the night he threw us out. He believed his genetics were the sole determinant of success. And since Matthew had a chromosomal abnormality, he had decreed the boy a failure before he even had a chance to try. Richard was unaware of the nights of study, the military discipline, the intelligence that surpassed that of anyone else in that room. He was unaware that the burden had become the highest medical authority on that shift. I glanced at the wall clock. It was 1015 a.m. Dr. Matthews' shift in the complex case triage wing began at exactly 1000. Richard was here because his case was serious and required a specialist's signature to authorize a high-cost procedure or a specific admission, something his now failing health insurance was blocking. He was here depending on the goodwill of the chief resident. "Aren't you going to answer me?" Sarah Richard insisted, tapping the tip of his cane on the floor, impatient with my silence. "Where did you stick the kid? Some government facility? Or is he still living off you, spending what little you must make?" His voice rose, attracting more attention. He wanted to humiliate me publicly, to feel a little bigger as his illness was making him feel so small. I settled into my chair, crossed my legs, and looked directly into his jaundiced eyes. "Matthew isn't in a facility, Richard. And he doesn't live off me. In fact, he pays my bills now. He bought me my house. He takes care of me." Richard let out a hoarse laugh, an ugly sound that ended in a cough. "Pays your bills doing what? Selling candy on a street corner, panhandling on the internet with a sob story." At that precise moment, a beep sounded from the reception desk. The head nurse, a serious woman I knew well, stood up and looked in our direction. The double doors to the restricted area opened with a hydraulic sigh. The hallway lit up. Firm, rhythmic footsteps echoed on the floor. They were not shuffling steps. They were the steps of someone with a purpose and in a hurry. A young man emerged, tall with an impeccable posture, a white coat with the hospital's crest embroidered on the pocket, a Littmann stethoscope around his neck. He was holding an aluminum clipboard and discussing something serious with two residents who followed him, scribbling down his every word. He had the physical features of Down syndrome, yes, but they were mere details against the aura of authority he emanated. He stopped in the center of the reception area, scanned the room, and found me. His serious face lit up with a professional but affectionate smile. "Mom," he said, his voice, the firm, deep baritone of a grown man. "Sorry for the delay. Rounds in the ICU ran a little long. The case in bed 3 needed an emergency spinal tap." He walked toward me, completely ignoring the old stooped man beside me. Richard stopped laughing. His mouth fell slightly open. His eyes darted from my face to the doctor's face, trying to connect the dots, trying to comprehend the impossible. Matthew kissed me on the forehead and then turned to the nurse. "Sandra, where is the chart for the priority patient sent over from Intake A, Richard Vasconcelos? His renal profile is critical. I need to evaluate him now." Richard's cane fell from his hand. The clatter of the wood on the marble floor was the only sound in the room. He stared at the ID badge hanging from the doctor's neck. "Dr. Matthew M., Chief Resident Clinical Neurology." He read the name, read the title, and looked at the face of the son he had thrown into the rain. The son he had called useless. The son who now held his life on an aluminum clipboard. "You, Richard," whispered the color draining from his already pale face. "It can't be." Matthew finally looked at the man. He didn't flinch, didn't tremble. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the chart in his hand, and then looked into his biological father's eyes with the clinical coldness of a surgeon evaluating necrotic tissue. "Richard Vasconcelos?" he asked in a clean, distant tone. "I'm Dr. Matthew. I'll be in charge of your case from now on. Please come with me." That moment wasn't just a reunion. It was a total reversal of the power dynamic. The giant had become an ant, and the ant had become the giant. I watched Richard try to stand his legs, trembling not from illness but from shock. He had to lean on the counter for support. He looked at me, searching for some kind of explanation, some kind of rescue. But I just smiled a calm smile and gestured toward the exam room. "Go on, Richard. The doctor is waiting for you. And you should thank God because he's the best doctor this hospital has." The stage was set for the finale. There would be no shouting, no drama, only the naked, raw reality of competence defeating prejudice. Richard was about to walk into the office of the son he rejected, and I knew the consultation that would take place in there would be about much more than kidneys or livers. It would be about the rotten soul of a man who had to lose everything to understand the value of what he threw away. The final act was beginning, and I had a front row seat to watch justice be served not with vengeance, but with excellence. The silence that settled over the reception after Matthew's words was so thick I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and Richard's short, noisy breaths. He remained frozen, gripping the edge of the marble counter so tightly his knuckles were white. Life's irony hadn't just knocked on his door. It had kicked it down with the force of a hurricane. The man who had always boasted of his superior genetics, his flawless health, and his material success was now a trembling husk before the young man he had tried to erase from existence. Matthew didn't wait for an emotional reaction. As a doctor, he had no time for drama that wasn't clinical. He motioned for Richard to follow him into the examination room. I walked just behind them, maintaining a respectful distance but determined to witness the closing of this circle. Inside the room, the atmosphere was sterile, lit by white fluorescent lights that left no room for shadows or lies. Matthew sat behind his desk, pulled up the digital chart, and began dictating notes in a monotone, professional voice. "Your case of renal failure is advanced, Mr. Vasconcelos. The labs show that neglect of your diabetes treatment has led to an almost total failure of kidney function. Furthermore, the neuropathy in your legs explains the difficulty with locomotion," Matthew said without taking his eyes off the screen. Richard, sitting in the patient's chair, seemed to have shrunk. He looked at Matthew with a mixture of terror and a sudden opportunistic hope. "Matthew, my son Richard began," his voice breaking, trying to forge a connection he himself had destroyed. "I didn't know. I never imagined that you. I'm so sorry." Matthew stopped typing. He looked up and stared directly at Richard. There was no hatred in his eyes, only an oceanic distance. "Mr. Vasconcelos, let's establish the terms here so the treatment can be effective. I am your doctor. You are my patient. That is the relationship we have. You are not here because you are my father, because my father David died before I was born. You are here because this hospital denies aid to no one, and my ethics compel me to do my best for any human being, regardless of who they are or what they've done." Richard bowed his head and a single tear rolled down his wrinkled face. He tried to argue. He said the woman he left me for had abandoned him as soon as the money ran out and his health deteriorated. He said he was alone with no one to look after him during his hemodialysis sessions. He was begging for pity, for a forgiveness that would make his life easier now that he was at the end of it. I, leaning against the wall of the exam room, felt only a profound sense of relief. It wasn't pleasure in his suffering. It was the confirmation that fate had been just. The burden he had discarded was now the only hand extended in his direction, but it was a professional hand, not a submissive one. The consultation continued in a technical manner. Matthew prescribed medications, scheduled the admission, and gave the necessary instructions. He acted with a nobility that Richard would never comprehend. At the end, Matthew stood up, clipped his pen into his coat pocket, and said, "The nursing team will escort you to your room. I'll make my rounds tomorrow morning. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Vasconcelos." We left the room and returned to the reception area. An orderly took Richard away in a wheelchair, a man defeated by his own story. I looked at my son now standing beside me and saw the extraordinary man I had helped build. He put an arm around my shoulder, kissed the top of my head, and sighed. "It's all right, Mom. The past has no power over us anymore. He's just a patient who needs help, and I'm going to help him, but he will never be a part of our family." In that moment, I understood the final lesson of this whole journey. Richard's abandonment on that stormy night 22 years ago was not a tragedy. It was the greatest gift life could have ever given me. If he had stayed, Matthew never would have flourished this way. Richard would have suffocated my son's brilliance with his prejudice and bitterness. He would have kept me small, insecure, and unhappy. His no was God's yes to our victory. Fate cleared away the rubble so we could build a palace of love and dignity. We walked out of the hospital together. The Boston sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass of the skyscrapers. We had a celebratory dinner planned, a celebration for the new stage in Matthew's career. I looked at him, at his calm smile, and felt that my mission was complete. Richard would remain there, receiving the technical and humane treatment Matthew would give any stranger, reaping the loneliness he had sown for 2 decades. We, on the other hand, would continue walking toward the light. Life truly is perfect in its reckonings. It doesn't demand revenge. It simply asks that we keep walking with integrity. Evil destroys itself, while good grows deep roots and bears sweet fruit. I am Sarah, and today I know that the best place in the world is here, next to those who love us without conditions or exceptions. Sharing the end of my story with you brings me an immense peace. I hope that somehow my journey and Matthew's can serve as a light for your own difficult days. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from now and what time it is in your city. I'd love to know that we've been together in this moment. A warm hug to your heart, and never forget, sometimes what looks like an abandonment is actually a great liberation. God bless you.